everyone. Welcome to the Wallingford Public Library. Tonight, I am very pleased to welcome back Vin Testa, who grew up here in Wallingford and is now currently the LGBTQ Liaison with DC Public Schools, where he receives monthly training from their central office team on working with LGBTQ identifying youth, and then he provides that training to his colleagues at the school level. So tonight he's here to tell us all about A to Z LGBTQ. Please help me welcome Vin Testa.
Thank you, Julie. All right, thank you so much for coming out. To clarify, I am also a teacher, so I teach math at the high school level, and I have been filling the role of LGBTQ liaison in DC Public Schools for all 8 of my years teaching there. And as Julie said, I get that training. I get training on how to work with our youth and how to provide safe and inclusive spaces for our youth. I get that training and then I bring it back to my school and provide it to my colleagues so that we are creating those safe and inclusive spaces for our youth, no matter their sexual orientation, gender identity, so on and so forth. I am going to pass out a little bit of paper, not for any crazy reason. You're not going to be quizzed or anything like that, but mostly just in case, oh, thank you, Julie. Just in case you have questions, there is going to be an activity where I do ask you to write some stuff down, but nothing, again, you're not going to get a quiz, don't worry. So my goal today here, this is considered a professional development workshop. I want there to be discussion if you feel comfortable. I want you to ask questions. I want you to, just speak up and speak out. But these are going to be about 26, I think now, because I added a couple things. There are some letters that have 2 terms because I couldn't pick. So there's about 26 to 28 maybe terms that folks need to know when they're working with young people or any person who identifies under the acronym of LGBTQ. And there are other letters, we're going to talk about them, but these are, when I use the acronym in this training, I usually stop at the Q and either add a plus sign, just so we're including other identities. So that's something to keep in mind. My objectives for this evening, I want you to be able to leave here comfortable with terms and slang relative to the LGBTQ community. I want to dispel myths about certain identities and orientations within the community. And then I also want to explore best practices for working with LGBTQ identifying youth, but also just people in general, so that we could go out and be better humans. I think we need a little bit of that these days. Please note, and I put this at the bottom because it's very important to recognize that I stand up here before you as a cisgender, and you'll find out what that term means. Cisgender, white, gay, male, okay? So I can only speak to my experience. Now, what I am aiming to do is hopefully introduce you to some terms that you're unfamiliar with so that you can go out and understand what those terms mean. But by no means am I speaking to someone else's experience. And by no means am I representing or speaking up for another community. That is never what I intend to do, so I want to respect those experiences that are not mine, but also speak to my own in certain ways. We don't need norms, but if you can, just make sure that your electronics are turned off at this time. And then please be comfortable with being uncomfortable, okay? It is okay to not know something. It is okay to not understand something, particularly if it's brand new to you. Sit in that discomfort and work through it, and hopefully I can help you get through that so that you can walk out of here with a little bit more, just some more knowledge about the community. Ask questions, whether that be publicly or privately. I am going to ask that you keep them, there's a period at the end that I'll take all of them at once. So that is partly why you got a piece of paper, and if you don't have one, there's some in the back here. So you can write them down and ask them at the end, or you can write them down and hand them to me later. I can answer them in a private conversation. I can answer them via email, but I don't want you to leave here without having them answered so that you feel comfortable, as I stated earlier. And We're going to leave our personal beliefs, whether religious, political, anything, we're going to leave that at the door. Hopefully when you crossed over that threshold, it is because you are open to learning about new experiences, new identities. So we want to respect that. And by all means, all beliefs and everything should be respected. But I ask that we not bring that into the conversation in a way that is demeaning or disrespectful to anyone that we're going to be discussing, any community we're going to be discussing this evening. And then finally, we're going to respect all experiences, identities, and stories. That kind of goes along with the last one. As I mentioned, I'll take questions at the end. Questions, comments, or concerns. I could either collect them or you can answer them or ask them publicly. And so before I get started and jump into the alphabet, I want to kind of ask some guiding questions that, I mean, if you feel comfortable, you can raise your hand and respond. I'm kind of open to this is new, I'm adding this on this year. These could be guiding questions as you sit through this presentation, whatever you feel. So I want you to think about how you would feel if your child came out to you as LGBTQ. And I want you to also think about what if it were a parent or a sibling or family member, and if those experiences would be different or similar. I want you to think about if you've ever been to an LGBTQ social event, march, parade, worship service. And if you have or have not, why? I want you to think about if you've ever laughed at a joke that was made at the expense of LGBTQ identifying people. And conversely, I want you to think about if you've ever stood up for an LGBTQ identifying person who was being harassed. And again, why or why not? And lastly, if you do not identify as LGBTQ, how would you feel if people thought you were? Or if you did? Okay? So think about those as we're going through. I may revisit them at the end. As I said, this is A to Z, so we're going to start off with A, and A is for asexual. Asexual people who identify as asexual, it's generally characterized by not feeling sexual attraction or having partnered sexual activity. So that is to say that asexual people can absolutely fall in love. They can absolutely be romantic. It is not to say that these people don't have sex or don't have those experiences. It's just a lack of attraction. And so that is one thing that often gets attached to that identity is like, if you're asexual, that means you don't feel anything. They can absolutely feel love towards another human, another person. It's just not sexual, and it's not motivated by those feelings. They are also able to have sexual intercourse. It doesn't bring about any emotional feelings. B is for bisexual. So of, relating to, or characterized by a tendency to be physically, romantically, and or emotionally attracted to men and women, and those who identify as such. We're going to talk about another term later on that sort of encompasses a little bit more. You would think that bisexual is a term that encompasses everything, but it's not. So we're going to talk about that a little later, but that's the traditional definition of bisexual. With bisexuality, there are several myths that need to be dispelled right this second. When we're talking about bisexual people, one, it is not just a phase. Unfortunately, it gets tacked on as a phase because a lot of people who identify as gay or lesbian often take that step in the middle to say I'm bisexual first. And speaking to my own experience, that's what I did. I thought I might have just been bisexual and that I had attraction towards men and women. Come to find out that was wrong. For me in particular. But that's to say that is a very large myth about bisexual identifying people. That it doesn't really exist, that they're really gay but unwilling to acknowledge it yet. Only women are truly bisexual. These are all myths that get thrown around. And that bisexual people are promiscuous since they are attracted to everybody, right? So they must have a lot of sex. No, not true. Myths about bisexuality. We're going to leave them here today. This term I mentioned in my own identity as cisgender. And in fact, many people, I can't put a number to it, but many people, including many of you in this room, identify as cisgender. And what that is a term used to describe people who, for the most part, identify as the gender they were assigned at birth. In addition to the term, what about this definition might stand out to you? Assigned at birth. And that's how I'm going to talk about sex in terms of gender. The sex that you were assigned at birth. Because we know, or perhaps we don't, but it is a label that is attached to you when you are born. And I'm going to talk in great detail about how I believe that gender is a social construct. But when I refer to sex, I refer to the sex they were assigned at birth, because when we talk about our transgender brothers and sisters, those folks don't identify with the sex they were given at birth. They feel as though they were born in the wrong body. And that is a feeling that I, and some of you, as cisgender people, do not have to experience. And that is a psychological toll that is taken on our trans brothers and sisters. So, that is cisgender. Drag queens and kings. How many of you have ever seen a drag queen or king? Yes, all right. Mom, it's probably because of me. She's been to many a drag show with me. And they commented on how great her shoes were, too. Okay. Drag queens and kings are people who present socially in clothing, name, and or pronouns that differ from their everyday gender identity, gender identity. Drag queens typically live as men, and drag kings typically live as women when they're not performing. However, there are some exceptions. There are women who are very empowered by drag queen makeup and drag queen performance, and vice versa. There are cisgender men who feel like if they add a little makeup but still present masculine and perform that way, that they're still doing drag. So as RuPaul says, drag, you're born naked and the rest is drag. Okay? So it is not to be confused with transgender. Although there are plenty of transgender people who discover their gender identity through drag, it is not the same thing. It is not one and the same. And as I mentioned, RuPaul, probably the most famous drag queen in the world. E is for effeminate. So when we're talking about having feminine qualities untypical of society's views of a man, not manly in appearance or manner. So we assume that somebody with an effeminate voice or effeminate qualities is automatically gay. But that's not true. And so we're also going to talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how societal norms, gender roles, kind of feed into an unhealthy view of LGBTQ people. This is a tough term. F is for faggot, and that is a derogatory term. It is often used to speak about a person who identifies as either gay or lesbian, and I've heard it used to describe people of all genders. It's not exclusive to men. But it is a derogatory term. I have, personally, I don't think this should happen, but I have heard it start to be reclaimed a little bit. And so it is used colloquially amongst people who identify as gay or lesbian or LGBTQ. But that's not for everybody else. So similar to the N-word, it has been reclaimed and by some in the community, and it is a point of contention because the bottom line is it is a derogatory term that is used to hurt, not help. Now G, you would think, would stand for gay, but that was too easy. So G stands for gender nonconforming. It's a person who is or is perceived to have gender characteristics that do not conform to traditional or societal expectations. Other terms for this are gender queer, gender fluid, and non-binary. Similar terms, but not necessarily one and the same. The bottom line is with gender nonconforming people, they either express themselves or identify themselves outside of societal norms. So Somebody who is non-binary or gender non-conforming will often use singular they pronouns. So referring to themselves and asking that you refer to them with they, them, or their, instead of he, him, his, or she, her, hers. That is because they don't like what is attached to either of those labels. What I want you to think about now, because this is what we've been taught, and again, going back to assigned sex at birth, we've been taught that there is male and there is female. And there are all sorts of things that fit into those two boxes. But what if you don't fit into that box? What if you're a triangle trying to fit into a square box? That's what gender nonconforming is. So those are people who cannot fit into those boxes. We want to think about gender more as a spectrum. Similarly, sexual orientation is a spectrum. We want to get out of this idea that there are only two options, or only one option in some people's minds when you're talking about sexual orientation. So we want to get out of those boxes and stop thinking of these things as two options or however many. And that's what gender nonconforming falls under. Related to gender, we have gender expression, which is very self-explanatory, how you express yourself outwardly to those around you. And this goes back to kind of societal norms on what's masculine and what's feminine. But that is gender expression. It's how you outwardly express. Gender identity is an internalized realization of one's gender identity. It may not be manifested in their outward appearance or their place in society when we're talking about gender roles. Which leads me to gender roles, which are societal expectations of how an individual should act, think, and or feel based upon an assigned gender in relation to the binary biological sex system. Okay? What are some gender roles that we still hear to this day?
Cooking for women?
Yeah. Pretty much anything related to the home for women. Anyone else? Gender norms? Or gender roles, sorry.
Protector.
The protector, yes. And who's supposed to be the protector? I'm asking.
The male, the father.
The male, or the father, the man. He's supposed to protect everybody, okay? Those are gender roles. And again, these things are all separate. I identify as male, but sometimes I go out to the club in a pair of heels because it makes me feel sassy, okay? It makes me feel better because I know I can walk in them and rock them, okay? So my expression is female, but my gender identity has never changed. I still want you to use he, him, his pronouns, but I know that I look damn good in a pair of heels, okay? So these terms do not always correlate to each other or to a person's sexual identity or orientation. H is for homosexual. Again, pretty self-explanatory. We know this term, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and or sexually attracted primarily to those of the same gender. The reason I say that this is a clinical term, in parentheses here, is because you're not going to find let me not say you're not going to find any. You're going to find very few people who identify as homosexual call themselves a homosexual. Mostly because, for the longest time, that term appeared in a psychological journal that said we were disordered. So that is a clinical term that isn't used very often anymore. We have our identities now. We have words to describe those identities. So homosexual is that's not really for us anymore. You could say same sex. You could say gay. You could say lesbian. Just don't use homosexual, because up until 1970-something, that was a really bad term for us. I is for intersex. Now, intersex people, or people who identify as intersex, naturally develop primary and or secondary sex characteristics that do not fit into society's definition of male or female. So that could be internally, that could be externally. It's a biological thing that happens. And many visibly intersex babies or children who are born are surgically altered when they are born. So the most common thing is, let me not claim that. One of the ways that someone could be intersex is when they are born, their genitalia does not explicitly dictate whether they are male or female. So they are surgically altered to be one or the other. Now what that does is when that intersex person then goes through puberty, they are very, very, very confused. Because you have people who may have identified male their whole life who start growing breasts or experiencing female puberty symptoms. That is kind of what happens with intersex identifying people. It is relatively common. I don't have a specific number for you, but it is something that was not spoken of for the longest time because there was no identity to be associated with it. So the intersex community is a community that is speaking up at like exponential rates because they finally have a voice and they have a definition for what they are going through. The derogatory term these days that was often associated with these folks was hermaphrodite. A hermaphrodite is a mythical creature that has both genitalia. That's not humanly possible. Therefore, hermaphrodite is a terrible term to call somebody and does not exist, which is why we were able to finally have an identity of intersex. So hermaphrodite, no. Intersex, yes. And there are at least 16 different ways to identify as intersex. Again, that could be internally, that could be externally. There was a beautiful article written in, I believe, the Washington Post, maybe a year or two ago, that kind of went through the intersex community and interviewed people who identify as such. And I would suggest if you have a moment to find that online when this is all over to really get a better grasp on it. Again, I don't speak for that community, so I don't know 100% everything about it, but that article was perfect. J is for Jesus, which is a good segue into religion and the LGBTQ community. We know who Jesus is, hopefully, whether you are Christian or not. Hopefully you know whether you are Jewish, whatever religion you practice, we know who Jesus is. But again, it is a segue into religion's impact, particularly on our LGBTQ youth. There was a study done, and it was published in March of 2018 in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. Over 21,000 people aged 18 to 30 who expressed that they were religious and that they had a religious background were interviewed. 5% of those people who identified as heterosexual, now I forgot to include the breakdowns of what the percentages were of the people who identify as such, but 5% of the heterosexual youth reported attempts to commit suicide. 20% of bisexual identifying youth reported attempting. Again, this is not thinking about. This is attempting suicide. 17% of our queer or questioning youth and 14% of gay and lesbian youth. Unfortunately, the sample size was too small for our transgender identifying youth in this particular study, but I'll go into statistics later about our trans youth. Alarming. I mean, 2, 3, 4 times more likely to happen than with heterosexual identifying students or youth. So that is the impact that religion has on our youth. So when we have these religions who dispel LGBTQ identities, this is the effect. When we have pastors sitting up on the pulpit saying that they think that LGBTQ people should burn in hell or should go kill themselves, this is the effect. They actually will. They will attempt it. So we need to think about that when we have somebody in front of us who says such. Challenge it. Question it. Where in the Bible is that? Where in the Quran is that? Where is it? Because I need to know. Because they also told me not to eat shellfish. They also told me not to wear a blend of fabrics, a blend of whatever, polyester, cotton, I don't know. So we need to think about how we're taking things seriously and what things should be just a moral guide. K is for the Kinsey scale. Now, those of you who don't know, Alfred Kinsey was a biologist, but regarded as the father of sexology, the study of human sexuality. He developed a scale on measuring sexual orientation that was far ahead of its time. and should be recognized for how important it was to the conversation of sexual orientation. The Kinsey scale went from 0 to 6. And if you look here, 0 was exclusively heterosexual, 6 exclusively homosexual. And that was how he studied people and gave them a rating on the scale. And this was the first look at sexuality not just being straight or not. That there was some in between. That you could have the thoughts, but maybe you just don't want to act on them. That's okay. You know, this was the first conversation. There were some dissenting viewpoints and criticism, though. Today, we see it as simplistic because now we're seeing that there's so much more. That it's not just homosexual and heterosexual either, and that's not just what's on the scale. That the sample size was just men in 1948, and that those men, there were overrepresented groups, particularly like jailed men and commercial sex workers and people who may have had experiences that contributed to their sexual orientation or their sexual experimentation. And there was a lack of diversity in terms of racially. But again, it was the first of its kind, and this was the basis of so many conversations that brought us to where we are today. L is for lesbian. I did go for the gimme on this one. L is for lesbian. A woman whose enduring physical, romantic, and/or emotional attraction is to other women. Some lesbians may prefer to identify as gay or as gay women, but L is for lesbian. Now, this is also important to understand that when we say a woman, we're talking about somebody who identifies as female. So that does include trans women who are also attracted to other people who identify as women. A trans woman who is attracted to another woman, no matter how they identify, as long as it's woman, female, is also a lesbian. Because gender identity and sexual orientation are two separate things. M is for men-loving men or men who have sex with men. This is also a clinical term, and it's most commonly used when talking about communities of color. The reason being this was a term that was clinically used, particularly in the healthcare field, and particularly when you're talking about the rise in HIV and AIDS. So loving men or men who have sex with men were actually often heterosexual in their identity, but played around, I don't know if that's inappropriate, were sexually active with other men, although they didn't necessarily find themselves attracted to such, which may sound a little confusing, but when they started taking statistics on AIDS and HIV and all of that was going on, even STIs, sexually transmitted infections, that was a class of people, that men who were heterosexual but who had sexual intercourse with other men. All right, we're going to have some activities in just a moment, but this is our last one before I break into our first little activity. N is for nature versus nurture. So this debate concerns the importance of an individual's innate qualities, their nature, what's going on around them, what they're born with in terms of identity and all of that, versus versus personal experiences in determining or causing individual differences. So nurture being your environment, how you were raised, examples of things that you experienced throughout your life, and how that may have... This is used in the debate whether you were actually born gay or not. Hint, yeah, you are. You're born that way. But there are experiences that may have contributed to the questioning of your sexual orientation or your gender identity. So I could see both sides, but not the cause of nurture, rather nature bringing you up and nurture bringing you to the point of understanding your identity or orientation. So we have an activity, as I said, and I'm gonna ask for volunteers. This is called the heterosexuality questionnaire. Again, I need volunteers who identify as heterosexual. So I'm going to ask for one volunteer so far for our first question. Yes. Shannon, I know Shannon. When and where did you first decide you were heterosexual?
Great question.
Yeah, right. Think about it.
Yeah, well, I think that in a heteronormative society, that's not something you necessarily stop with.
You're absolutely right. Now, was it when you were a kid and you kissed a boy for the first time, or like, what do you think? When was the first time?
No, I felt like in high school.
Okay.
And I felt like,
When you felt confident in it?
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for volunteering. Do I have another volunteer? Maybe. Don't be scared, I promise. Yes. Do you suppose that your heterosexuality could just be a phase?
I think I go along with the spectrum belief, and I know this isn't great because you're saying that yes, people are born gay, but I do believe life is a spectrum in itself. So I would stick to the spectrum conversation on this too.
So it could be a phase. You could grow out of it.
It's funny, I don't know if I'd want to be defined by
Oh, I like this. Okay, excellent. Yes. I love that. Thank you. Another one. I got 3 more questions, so I need at least 2 more volunteers. Bagada, I also know Bagada. If heterosexuality is normal, why are so many mental patients heterosexual? We'll move on. We'll move on. There's her answer right there. There's her answer right there. What about another volunteer? There we go. Pressure from the child. Yep, I get it. If you've never slept with a member of your own sex assigned at birth, is it possible you might be gay if you tried it? Sorry to ask that in front of your child. I should have picked the other one. I should have picked the other one. Okay, yeah, roger that. Did anyone else want to answer that?
What was the question?
The question was, if you've never slept with a member of your own sex assigned at birth, is it possible you might be gay if you tried it?
Yes.
There we go. Now, I'll get to why that question is funny in just a moment. And then a final volunteer. No, oh yeah, you want to, okay, we'll try again. Would you want your child to be heterosexual knowing that they could face such problems as heartbreak, disease, and divorce? No, really, it's okay. She said, I have 2 gay children, it doesn't matter. So, why are those questions funny? Why should we laugh at those questions but also take them incredibly seriously?
Because they're the same questions that are faced to gay.
Excellent catch. Yes, absolutely. These are actual questions that get asked to the LGBTQ community. Real questions. Yeah, yikes. Okay. I don't think I've ever been asked because I think everybody knew. But the idea of it being a phase, like, yeah, is it a phase? Are they just going to grow out of it?
She's doing it because her sister is.
Oh, yeah. Oof.
She's not just doing it because Riley did.
God, it's gross. And even if she did, it doesn't matter. Because the bottom line is we're talking about allowing people to experience life on their terms. So, actually, this is another great segue. I love segues. Shannon, you posted, I'm sorry to call you out, but you posted in the Facebook event requesting resources on how to properly foster an elementary age student who may identify. Now, the common thing is like, oh, they're too young. They don't know. How could they ever know? False. Okay? False. The bottom line is, as parents, as educators, as allies, as family members, whatever you are to a young person, and let's say an elementary age student or person, we need to allow that exploration and that expression. So if a little boy, I'm putting quotes around that, if somebody who was assigned male at birth, a little boy, societal boy, wants to put on a dress, or wants to play with dolls, going back to gender norms and gender roles, you let that happen. Because we don't know what that young person is going through. They may grow up and follow the other gender norms and throw the best football out there. But in that moment, they want to play with dolls and they want to put on dresses. Because they may look up to their single mother who looks stunning in a dress and be like, I want to look stunning too. That's that part. Allow that exploration, allow that expression. Let the child develop. Mentally, physically, emotionally, let that development happen. When we're talking about trans folks, and we will later, hint, it's the T. When we're talking about trans folks, they may get to puberty and then decide that they hate the body that they're living in and that they're completely uncomfortable. Going back to intersex people, they may get to puberty and realize, oh my God, what did that doctor do to me when I was a child? What did they do to me surgically when I was born? So we need to allow all of that. We need to allow the mental, emotional, and physical development to happen and then find the resources and address it as it comes. We can't stop it when it happens because then that child suppresses that and it turns into psychological damage. I'm certainly not saying that you have to do this as a parent, family member, so on and so forth, but it may be a good idea to use gender-neutral pronouns, going back to the singular they. Refer to the child just by their name. And even then, they may want to change their name eventually, but use gender-neutral pronouns. Say they, them, their, instead of he or she. Let them explore that. Yes?
Two questions. When an intersex child is born,
Mm-hmm.
does the doctor have responsibility to talk to
Absolutely. Excellent question. Does the doctor, going back to intersex, does the doctor have a responsibility to talk to the parents? Absolutely. And I think, so I hate to say it this way, but the parents are at fault as well. And I don't mean to say it that way, but it's true. Because in that moment, and for years, parents didn't know this. So this is not a thing that I'm blaming anyone. But now, with this identity of intersex, what we can now say is, let it go. And let the child just grow and develop. Go ahead.
Saying it's comparable to a child having been adopted but not told.
Yeah. I would say it is a little similar. Absolutely. Because you're keeping something from the child that is detrimental to their development and their psychological well-being. I would say even more so than, it is comparative to adoption, but a little bit more detrimental because you're talking about their entire identity. But yes, thank you. So yes, it is a responsibility of the parents as much as it is the doctors because the parents are the ones sitting there choosing whether they want to have a little girl or a little boy. And it's not their choice. And then lastly, make those young children aware without fear. And I'll clarify what I mean by that. Introduce them to the LGBTQ people you know. Introduce them to the people who are examples that could be examples in their life. If you think that your child is experimenting with their gender identity, I'm not just saying go out on the street and find somebody who's trans or find somebody. But if they were assigned male at birth, surround them or introduce them to females. And you think that, if they're assigned male at birth and they're thinking and they're going around saying, I want to be a little girl, I want to be female, introduce them to strong women and see if that works. See if that's where they go. But again, let it happen. And then also take them to events, to festivals, to parades, to marches. Bring them to those events and see if they identify and see if they feel excited. See if they feel like it's exactly where they need to be. Because that's what happened when I went to my first Pride March in New York in 2009. I was not out yet, but my best friend from high school was. And I got to that Pride Parade and I was like, holy moly, this is where I need to be. These are the people I need to surround myself with. Because the energy was electric. And that's straight or not. Pride Parades are awesome. So, anyways.
Middletown have their
Yes, Middletown just had their first one. I saw that on the news. That's huge. I think, is it the only one in Connecticut? In June. Oh, okay, there are other ones. Okay. So I hope that helps. If you have any further questions about how to provide the proper resources to particularly young children, please let me know at the end. O is for out, and it refers to being publicly open about one's sexual orientation. Out is short for out of the closet. I do want to mention though, how many of you watch Queer Eye on Netflix? Anyone? If you don't, you should. It's a phenomenal show. But one of the gentlemen on that show, his name's Karamo, and he is kind of like the one that probably causes everybody to cry the most, because he has those inward conversations with people and those deep breakthroughs with the people on the show. And Karamo said, I'm going to stop telling people that I came out, and I'm going to start saying that I let you all in. So that, I kind of love that. And I haven't started saying it in my regular everyday language or vernacular, but I love that, and I like to share that as well. So it's not me coming out, because technically I've always been who I am. People who know me know that not much changed after I told people I was gay. I was still me. So I'm letting you in to that little part of my life. And that's how I like to look at it. Coming out of the closet is, the process of coming out is ongoing, and it continues throughout life. The reason it is ongoing is because you will meet a new person every day. And Shannon used the term heteronormative earlier. Heteronormative being the way that society kind of lends itself to heterosexual people. That's what that means. Going back to gender roles, going back to expression, all those things, societal norms. It leans towards heterosexual folks. So when we're talking about coming out, it is an everyday thing, because you are going to meet somebody new every day, and the conversation is eventually going to get to who you're sleeping with, or who you're married to, or that you were born differently than how you express yourself now in relation to our trans community. So it's an everyday thing. It never ends. And it's how you navigate that is why we put so much emphasis on coming out. It's varied, and it's not experienced by all people. For example, I was very blessed to have a phenomenal coming out experience. I did it via Facebook, social media, age, I don't know. But I did it via Facebook, and nobody cared. Nobody cared. I was crying in my dorm room my junior year of college. And I thought I was going to walk into the cafeteria the next day and be like, I don't know, terrified. I mean, I was terrified walking in. And the first thing that happened was this girl who I barely knew came up and gave me the biggest hug. I'm like, come on, make this a little more dramatic for me. But that's to say that my experience is a million times better than others. A million times. There are people kicked out of their homes. There are people who are fired. There are people, and in at least 30 states, nope, I lied, at least 25, I think we're getting better. In at least 25 states, you could still be fired from your job for being gay. I won't even get into the religious stuff, at religious high schools and things like that. But at least 25 states, you could be fired for your sexual orientation. Yes?
What does that mean?
It means if somebody finds out that you have a partner who is of the same sex, they can fire you, and you can't sue them because it's not in the law.
That's seriously an option.
That is seriously an option. They wouldn't say that. They wouldn't dare say that in the time that we live in. They would probably find some other thing. But if you knew it was because you were gay and you went and sued them, they'd be like, even if that was the answer, or even if that was the reason, it's legal, because there's nothing in our hate crimes that says we can't do it on sexual orientation.
There's a commercial now, just came out this month about that.
That says that?
Yeah,
If I'm not mistaken, you are protected in Connecticut,
in Connecticut,
so
yes.
that's great. And I work in DC, which has the most extensive human rights laws in the country. We cover at least 14 or 15 different classifications down to weight, age, disability, so on and so forth. But that is not the case in majority of our states. And then National Coming Out Day is October 11th. So those of you who are educators, those of you who work with youth, emphasize that day. Make that a big day. And all my folks who identify as heterosexual, you could come out as an ally. Coming Out Day is for you as well. You could come out as an ally and say, I am there for you. I respect you. I am your ally. Okay? So know that. We have another activity. I love activities. So this is called Out Role Models. So either in like pairs or small groups or by yourself, it does not matter. I'm going to put on my timer. I'm going to give you a minute and a half, 90 seconds, to write down, here's the paper, to write down as many out celebrities, people who are publicly gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer, so on and so forth, as you can. You may not use your phones, and you may not start before I say go. So, this is supposed to be a challenge. Don't feel bad if you can't name any. But I guarantee in this day and age you can name a few. So I'm going to put that on. Hold on. 1 minute. 30 seconds. Ready, go. And keep your voices low because you don't want people to take your answers.
It's not who you were, it's who you are now.
Exactly.
And that applies to
Absolutely.
kids go to jail, they get out of jail, they're rejected.
Yeah.
You know, it's not
Oh, absolutely.
who you are now.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, don't even get me started on criminal reform.
The mom and his son went to jail for 5 years. When he came out of jail, this was a really college student. Before his he gave lessons. He came out. I prayed for that kid. He was in jail.
Oh,
You want to change.
and sometimes it takes those experiences.
I accept it.
Yeah, for sure. That's amazing, first of all, because that does not happen all the time. Yes, first female. They just didn't know. That's amazing. And that is not a common experience, unfortunately. Yeah, of course. I mean, there's a grieving process that happens there. There's grieving. And we could chat about that. All right, pens down. Pens down. So in our little groups or solo, if I could just hear, give me a number. How many did you get? 4?
14.
14. Ooh, okay. We watch our 8, 7, 7. All right. Okay, 14. Jeez. All right. We got a real big ally over here. All right. Okay, so give me some names. Oh, wait. No. That's not how this activity works. No, yes, it is. Okay, give me some names.
Anderson Cooper.
Anderson Cooper. Ellen.
Jazz Jennings.
Jazz Jennings. We'll go into that. Huh? Adam Rippon, that's figure skater. Yes. Portia de Rossi, Ellen's wife and actress. Caitlyn Jenner. Melissa Etheridge. Chaz Bono. Oh my gosh, I love this. Sarah Paulson, yes. Neil Patrick Harris.
George Michael.
George Michael, rest in peace.
Adam Lambert.
Vice President.
Jodie Foster.
Yeah,
Oh yeah, Lynn Cheney. Awesome. These are all great. Okay. Yes. Yes. All right. Connecticut hero. All right. So, what I want you to do right now, look at your list. I want you to cross off everyone who's white.
What?
I want you to cross off everyone who is white. Yeah. And this is a lot more, I'm not going to say it's a lot more effective, but it's a lot more important when you're talking to educators. And luckily we live in a day and age where in 2019, and I'm partially attributing this if you look around, everyone's white in this room right now. So, unless I'm presuming. You're white presenting, at least. So that's to say that I don't expect you to know, LGBTQ people of color as much as you know people who look like you. But I would challenge you to learn those names. Because those are the names that are contributing to the mental health of young people of color. And for a very long time, I would say within the last 5 years, we've had this spark in out celebrities of color. But it is important to realize that for the longest time, it was really only okay to be gay if you were white. And that goes back to stigma within communities of color. But it is incredibly important to recognize that as people who present as white, who are white, when you have that conversation or when you are talking to a young person of color or an adult of color. Yes?
Can you name a few other than RuPaul?
Absolutely. You have Billy Porter. You have Karamo Brown, who is on Queer Eye right now. Laverne Cox. You have the entire cast of Pose on FX. MJ Rodriguez, Dominique Jackson. There are these shows now that we have as references. Of course, I'm blanking.
It's like a newscaster.
Yeah, Don Lemon. Don Lemon on CNN. Yes.
There's a comedian who did a show with,
Oh yeah, Wanda Sykes.
Wanda Sykes. Yes. We have these role models now, which is incredibly important. But it is important to recognize the role that race plays even within the LGBTQ community. Yes.
Obviously, a big moment was Michael Sam.
Oh, Michael Sam, yes. Michael Sam was a college football player who was drafted into the NFL. Jason Collins was an active NBA player who came out. He was the first active NBA player to come out.
NBA.
I might be wrong, actually. He might have retired and then came out. But
British?
regardless. No, he's an American. So that's what that activity does. It's supposed to do. It's supposed to help you recognize that, yeah, there are a lot of people who are out right now. We're lucky that they're coming out in droves. But we want to recognize the role that race plays within our greater society, but also in the LGBTQ community.
I wonder about cultures too, about various cultures where it's more accepted to come out versus others.
Absolutely. Going back to religion and the Latinx community. So when you talk about the Latinx community, Christianity plays a huge role in that community. Religion is a huge part of that community. So it creates an even more toxic environment for those young people to come out as LGBTQ. And what that also does is it creates terrible things for their HIV and STI rates because they feel like they can't address their sexual health because then they'd be discovered that they were gay or lesbian or whatever. So it's this vicious cycle that just gets worse the more you go around. P stands for pansexual. So this goes, I'm going to refer back to when I talked about bisexuality. Pansexual is truly all-encompassing because essentially what pansexual means is that you are attracted to human. You are attracted to human regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, so on and so forth. You're just attracted to the human spirit. The reason that this term was created is because you have trans folks, you have non-binary folks, you have gender non-conforming folks. These identities now have words to be associated with them, so bisexual just doesn't cover it anymore. Because bisexual just is man and woman. Bi means two. And now that we've had this conversation, we know that there are not just two genders. Gender is a spectrum. Very good, everyone. Okay, so pansexual encompasses all of that, okay? With regard to biological sex, gender, or gender identity. P is a letter that I couldn't pick because pride is also super important. And as you may know, June is Pride Month. In its true definition, pride is the quality or state of being proud or a reasonable or justifiable self-respect. But within the LGBTQ plus community, it refers to events where people and their allies gather to celebrate their community. as we speak, I'm really sorry to say it, I'm really only here in Connecticut because I'm on my way to New York tomorrow for the World Pride celebration. World Pride is an international celebration that I think last year happened in Madrid it happens all over the world. And this year in particular, it is happening in New York City. They are expecting 4 to 6 million extra people in New York City this weekend, which is stressful, but it's exciting. Yes.
And New York actually throws like
Oh, DC does too. Youth Pride is becoming even more common. Youth Pride, Trans Pride, Black Pride for Black LGBT identifying folks. Because for the longest time, and this is actually very important to recognize, Pride also very, 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 I guess, catered to white people. So that is why we have, and particularly white, cisgender, gay males. So that is why these different prides are popping up as a part of the celebration of the month, because for the longest time, Pride in general just catered to the gay white men. All right? Let's see. Q is for queer, differing in its true definition, differing in some odd way from what is usual or normal. It's a political term that has been reclaimed by some LGBTQ people who find it empowering. I call myself a queer all the time, and I love it. I love it. Other people, not so much. The older generations who were called queer when the gay rights movement was starting, not so much, because it was derogatory. It was terrible to be called queer. I would say maybe like my generation down, but even some mixed views in my generation, some mixed views younger than me, because it is still used derogatorily in some ways. Some notes on queer. Again, used by some, particularly of younger generations. It was reclaimed from its negative use out of defiance, so defying that negative connotation. Because it's inclusive, queer kind of envelops every identity because it's just different in its true definition. And it's fluid. So perhaps I'm experimenting with my gender identity. I could still be queer the whole time. Or perhaps I'm experimenting with my sexuality, with my sexual orientation. I could just be queer the whole time, okay? So that's why some people are reclaiming it, because it's a very all-encompassing word. And it is a self-identifier. Going back to the mixed views on the word, you don't get to call, sorry, I'm saying you. Heterosexual identifying people should not use the term to describe somebody or to identify somebody else. Let the person self-identify, and then you have permission to identify them as such. So if somebody comes up to you and says, I'm queer, then you could turn around and say, they're queer. And then that person might be like, wow, you're really rude. But you'd be like, no, really, they self-identify. Okay? R is for realness. Now, I'm going to throw this out there. I doubt I'm going to get many hands. How many of you have seen the documentary Paris is Burning? Yeah, Julie. All right. Paris is Burning is a 1990 documentary on the ball culture of New York City, underground ball culture of New York City. Again, predominantly communities of color who created houses because the majority of them were kicked out of their own homes. These houses were created to form a family. And they had a house mother, they had a house father, and they would compete in these balls. So Madonna, the ultimate cultural appropriator, took voguing, the song Vogue, came from the ball culture and came from these underground competitions. The dancing, the moves that they all do came from the ball culture. These days, Pose is a show on FX that I suggest all of you watch. It's phenomenal. But it is like a resurgence of this ball culture. Now, to properly describe realness, I do have a video clip, which I love. This is from Paris is Burning.
To be able to plan. That's what realness is. untrained eye, or even the trained eye, not give away the fact that you're gay, that's when it's real.
Fangy, looking like the boy that probably robbed you a few minutes before you came to Paris' ball.
The idea of realness is to look as much as possible like your straight counterpart.
Shake the dice and steal the rice. Right here, come on, baby. Yes, daddy, I got my food stamps and card waiting. All right. Dust, coat, base soap, bromades, you got it.
The real English, you look like a real woman. Or you look like a real man. That's straight.
Sweetheart, with this hairnet, you're giving me a Banshee girl effect. This is Banshee. You know, the girls that be on the corner talking about, yo man, why they get hey out with the ruffin and the
It's not
nothing.
a takeoff or a satire.
Now we have to store me.
No, it's actually being able to be this.
Brenda Extravaganza, looking like a Banshee girl.
Okay.
Banshee.
So realness is the ability to pass, okay? Whether that be straight, if you're male identifying, it's the ability to pass as female. So there were these competitions and realness. You would there would be usually 4 or 5 judges up on the stage, and you would walk the runway in whatever costume or drag or whatever, and they would give you scores up to 10. Categories, yes, the categories. So if you saw there was a guy in a Merrill Lynch costume, that must have been like business realness. That's what the category would be. Or like for drag or for trans women, it would be like femme realness, like feminine realness. And then it would get judged, and the house that got the best rating would take home the trophy. And that was their competition. It was a way of life for the longest time, and it still happens. There are still balls in New York. There's balls in Baltimore. The ball culture is still very live and very amazing. But that's where realness comes from. And I figured I'd add a video clip this year. Okay. Let's see here. If it wants to load. There we go. S is for sexual orientation, the scientifically accurate term for an individual's enduring physical, romantic and or emotional attraction to members of the same and or opposite sex. This is what I talked about earlier, sexual orientation versus gender identity. So sexual orientation being, do you want to help me? Do you want to help? Sexual orientation versus gender identity. So the sexual orientation being the attraction to others, the gender identity being the understanding of oneself. So going back to what I said earlier, gender is a social construct. It is something that we've been taught that we have to fall into in whatever category you want to talk about. And that we have to fit into one of those boxes, right? Male or female. Gender identity is that internalized realization, and then the expression is the external manifestation. S is another one. When I go back to pride, S, I had to add in Stonewall. This is a new addition. I literally just added it today. Stonewall, the Stonewall Inn is a gay bar in New York City. At approximately 1:20 in the morning on June 28th, 1969, aka a few hours 50 years ago, the Stonewall Inn was raided by police. Now, this was very common in the 60s. Gay bars were raided all the time. They would raid them to find homosexuals, going back to that clinical term. They would find them and arrest, or they would raid them and find then who were called cross-dressers or transsexuals, outdated terms. But they would raid those bars and arrest those people because it was against the law back then. On this particular night, the police raided. Usually the bars would get a tip-off. They would know that the raid was going to happen, so they could either, tell people to calm it down or hide. At that time, I think gay bars weren't allowed liquor licenses, so they would hide the liquor. They would be tipped off. Stonewall Inn side note, was also run by the Italian Mafia. The Italian Mafia put money into making the Stonewall Inn a gay bar. Love that. So, the police raided. They started arresting people. The story goes, because there are no historical accounts, because nobody cared about gay people back then, that a lesbian was being loaded into the paddy wagon, and she was beat on the head with a baton, but she kept running away from the police, back and forth, like 4 or 5 times. And then finally, she looked at all the people standing around her and said, "What are you doing? Somebody do something." And that is when they started rioting. Those riots lasted for about 2 days, and then more and more. Thousands of people joined in, and it turned into the first unofficial Pride Parade. But it was a march. It was a march. And that is why even today people are saying, it is not a parade. It is a march. It has become corporate. It has become this extravagant celebration, but Pride started as a riot. And that is what we need to think about. And it was led by drag queens and trans women of color. That is another huge portion. Huge. Because again, I told you that so much of Pride and so much of our community, I say our, the LGBTQ community, is catering to white gay men. When in fact their rights started with trans women of color. So, the important thing is, in 2016, President Barack Obama deemed the Stonewall Inn a national monument. And it has that designation, and it is one of America's national parks, which is huge. It is deemed a national monument as the start of the gay rights movement. I'm going to try and get there this weekend, but I don't think I'm going to be able to. A lot of people. T is for transgender. Of, relating to, or being a person who identifies with or possesses a gender identity or gender expression that differs from the one which corresponds to the person's sex assigned at birth. Okay, so trans people are assigned one sex at birth, and that changes throughout their gender identity, their internal realization, and then they do something about it to change that. Transgender is an umbrella term. So I'm actually going to step up here for this one. If you look out here, the rain, it's not supposed to be a metaphor. We're not saying that these things are like sad or bad things. But you have feminine, you have women, you have masculine men, you have cisgender. Those are the things that do not fit under the umbrella. Under the umbrella, you have outdated terms that some people still identify with, such as transsexual or crossdresser, transvestite. Those are things that you don't really find people identifying with anymore, but those are still terms that could be used. You have androgyny, you have feminine men, male to female transitioning, female to male transitions. In the Native American cultures, you have two-spirit people. And that is something that is also being brought to light these days, because our Native American, the Native American people had this gender thing down long before we got here. Long before we got here. In some Native American cultures, there were up to 5 different genders. So they had it down long time ago. And then the white man came in and ruined everything. But that's a different story. So, problematic terms when you're referring to the trans community. You don't want to use, transgender in its true essence is an adjective. It is not a noun. So you don't want to say transgenders or a transgender. That's a noun. You want to say a transgender person, transgender people, or the trans community. And it is appropriate to shorten it to trans if you keep hearing me say that. That's okay. Appropriately. Problematic, going back to the type of word it is, transgender is not a verb either. Therefore, it cannot be past tense and transgendered. Adding that ed suffix, not only does it add the unnecessary length to the word, but it also it brings about a negative connotation of being like disordered or something like that. So transgendered, it isn't appropriate. And again, it's an adjective, not a verb or a noun. When we're talking about a trans person's journey, you don't want to say a sex change or pre-op or post-op or anything like that. You want to talk about their transition. It is a journey. Trans folks go through a very intense emotional, mental sometimes physical, not always physical. That's a very important part to say. Journey, and we call that a transition from one life to another. The reason we don't talk about the operation is because it's not about genitals. It's about that person's identity as a human. It has nothing to do with what's between their legs or up top, whatever. So when we say things like pre-op or post-op, that suggests that they have to have the operation if they want to identify as trans or want to identify as that gender that they identify with, which is completely inappropriate. And then you want to talk about defamatory words, she-male, he, she, it, tranny, those things, not appropriate. Those are derogatory terms that for a while might have been funny or might have been whatever, not so much anymore, because we now have an empowered community who understands their identity and who has proper words to say it. Therefore, it is our job as allies to respect those identities and those terms. Yes?
If you know someone
I think I know where this is going. Go ahead.
is transgendered,
Uh-huh.
is it okay to ask if they're going to
No.
go through the surgery?
Excellent question, but no, it is not appropriate.
Okay.
If that person wants to share their journey with you, that's fine. Again, going kind of like with queer, it's a self-identifying thing. If that person wants to document their journey or share their journey or tell you their story, absolutely it's appropriate to ask questions and get the info. But if they're not bringing it up, you don't bring it up, because then that reduces them to their genitalia. And we're talking about a whole human.
Right.
I appreciate that question. That was great. We are currently facing an epidemic in this country. And I call it an epidemic because it's more than should ever be happening. In 2018, the Human Rights Campaign noted that 26 deaths of transgender people due to violence. Whether that be murder, beating, whatever, they were killed. So far in 2019, there have been 11 deaths due to violence. Every single one of those 11 were black transgender women. What we also need to stop doing in 2019 is shaming sex workers. And I say that because some of these women, not all of them, were sex workers. Now, why were they sex workers? Because they couldn't get a job because they were transgender women. They could not get jobs in their community, and they could not get health care or things like that because they were black trans women. Therefore, they had to resort to going, and I will point right now, so that I say their names out loud, Ashanti Carmen and Zoe Spears were killed within a half mile of my house in Maryland. And they were killed in the spot of Maryland where sex workers walk. So it was just assumed that they were working that night. They both lived in a transgender housing facility, which is amazing that at least we have those resources. But they were out working, assumed to be, and they were both killed. Some of these other women, it was the same thing. So we need to bring notice to these women, and in addition, the two names at the bottom, Joanna and Leilene, were two Latinx trans women, one of whom died in the custody of ICE at one of those border facilities. The other, Leilene, died in her cell in Rikers Island. I cannot confirm whether or not Leilene was in a women's prison or not, but it is very likely she was in a men's prison. Yes?
You're differentiating between transgender women and transgender men?
Can you clarify that for me?
Well, you just said they're all trans women.
Yes, so when I say trans women, I'm talking about people who identify as women,
Right.
who may have been assigned male at birth.
Identify as men, you would say we're trans men.
Yes, so trans men are typically, I shouldn't say typically, are people who were assigned male or were assigned female at birth and transitioned to male.
Does it really matter that we know?
No, not at all. No, not at all. It's not important in the grand.
Prison, I understand.
Yeah.
Why? Because then it's where you're placed.
Yes.
But otherwise, it's really really none of our business.
And I love that you just said that. It is not any of our business. I think it's clear why I'm delineating now, because these women are being killed because they are trans. But in the grand scheme of things, no. They're women. They identify as women, therefore they are women. And it goes, there are plenty of people who will try to buck the system and try to give you the instances where, well, if we're just saying they're women, anybody could be a woman. That kind of mindset, right? To their core, these women were women. To their core. I have an example that still grinds my gears. Working in high schools, we have a women's, or a young women's flag football team, which, first of all, awesome. That's pretty cool. But it's a flag football team. One of the other schools had a male presenting person on their team. It was very well known that that person had just competed in a men's event in track the previous weekend, but was playing in the female flag football game that day. And that is because in DC Public Schools, in their sports, they cannot question when somebody wants to identify. But it was known that that young person did not identify as female. They were just trying to play the sport and give that school the upper hand. That is where our actual trans brothers and sisters, what are they supposed to say? What are they supposed to say when that happens? Where is their defense? Not to make a sports pun, but where is their defense then? Because you have people who are intentionally trying to go against the inclusivity and the self-identification. So, this is an epidemic. This needs to stop. And the sooner we speak up and say their names, the better things turn out, or the more we can help.
Side question. I didn't quite understand what the term Latin meant.
Oh, yes, sorry. Latinx is it's a newer term that kind of just all encompasses it kind of all encompasses the Latin community. So Latinx is, it's more like, yeah, if you're from Latin America, instead of just saying Latino and giving it the O, which automatically masculinizes it, we use Latinx so that it's not giving it a gender. Yes?
As an educator, like, how do you help youth navigate this very binary world, right? Like, you brought up sports.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my child will bounce between like the boy and girl line in elementary school, and that's kind of a simple.
Oh, that's one thing right there. Go ahead, keep going.
Like, these things exist, right? Like, I wish there wasn't even a boy and girl line. Like,
Right.
So these binary systems exist. So how do we create safe spaces for children and for youth who are not living in this binary construct we've set up?
When there is a binary presented to those children, you tell them to pick the one that feels the most comfortable. Hopefully, the adults in their life and in their school and in their surroundings support that. And don't automatically say, no, Billy, you have to go in the boy line because your name's Billy and you're a boy. Hopefully, that's not the case. But in terms of putting it on that child, let them choose. That's all about that exploration and that discovery that we hope that our children can go through. As a parent who may be sending a student to a school who, knowing that their child is exploring and discovering, make it very well known to the administration and to their teachers that that child will be going against any gender constructs that they are presented with. Because it allow and you know, as a parent, maybe even provide resources if you feel like the adults in that situation are not well informed on the topic. Going back to what I said earlier, provide them with examples of people who may have bucked the system or not been brought down by a construct or by gender roles or by gender norms. Was that helpful? Okay. Yeah, go, please follow up. We're wrapping it up soon. U is for unisex, refers to things that are suitable for either sex or any sex, gender identity. When we talk about particularly, and I hate this because I always say don't make it about bathrooms, but like this is kind of the easiest example for this. But in terms of like bathrooms, we now more say like gender inclusive bathrooms or whatever. Unisex is still appropriate. Yeah, I was really just going for the U here. Okay. V, violence. Exertion of physical force so as to injure or abuse. Going back to my role as an educator. This data is taken from the 2015 Youth Risk Behavior Survey given by the DC Office of the State Superintendent for Education. You can't see it at the bottom because it's cut off a little bit. 20,000 students participated. 17.6% of those students identified as LGB. Notice I cut off the T there because there weren't proper resources for our trans youth at the time. But 17.6% identified as LGB. If you look right around here, in middle school, the darker blue is heterosexual. 28% of those students were bullied on school property. 40% of our gay, lesbian, and bisexual students were bullied on school property. This is the messy part, and I hate this the most. 6.1% of students who identified as hetero were harassed on school property because someone thought they were lesbian, gay, bisexual. And then I highlighted this because even a few years ago for this survey, they had the wrong term and they put the ED on transgender. But 6.1%, 16.5% of LGB students said they were bullied just for having thought to be LGB. Okay, you want to get that? Can you go sit with mine? Okay, so those results continued. For the blue represents heterosexual, the green represents LGB. The 22.8% of our heterosexual participants felt so sad or hopeless almost every day for 2 weeks or more that they stopped doing some activities. 46.9% of those LGB students felt the same way. And then down here, 4.1% of our heterosexual identifying students made a suicide attempt that resulted in injury. 9% of our LGB students. That should be 0% for all, obviously, but it's troubling that it was over double for our LGB students. I'm going to skip over that real quick. So our tips for educators. If you are an educator in this room, I have tips for allies later too. Use these however they may fit. Please don't out our students to people without permission, and that includes colleagues. The only situation I could see that being acceptable is if the student is getting ready to harm themselves. That is the only way you should out somebody. And even then, you could tell somebody that a student is getting ready to harm themselves without saying that they're gay. There are ways to do that. But that's key there. Know your local resources, and I will provide some in just a minute. Apply policies equally. So if you're in the hallway and you tell two boys that they can't hold hands or kiss, you damn sure better be telling the boy and the girl the same thing. And with two females as well. PDA, dress code is a huge one. If the girls, no, I don't have a good example, but dress code. Dress code is another key thing in schools that needs to be all inclusive. Oh, right. If girls can wear skirts, so can boys. If boys can wear pants, so can girls. That's the simplest example. We're not putting people into wardrobes that are societal as well. Don't assume gender pronouns. So even though somebody is presenting, again, I told you I go to the club in some heels sometimes. That doesn't mean I want you to say she or her. So don't assume pronouns. Ask somebody. And I'll get into that, what's appropriate when asking as well in just a moment. Don't split a classroom by gender. So the boy and girl line, oh, that makes my skin crawl. Even when you're talking to the class, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, no. Young people, scholars, badass people, like any of those things work and are outside of gender, as particularly outside of the binary. So use those. Young people, I think I said that already. Treat homophobic and transphobic bullying like any other type of harassment. Don't give it less or more emphasis. You don't want to make it completely uncomfortable for the student being bullied, but you do want to let them know you care and that it's going to be addressed. Make it clear that complaints about bullying are anonymous and address situations when they arise. Don't leave it for a week and see if it gets better, because in that week, that child may kill themselves. Address it in the moment, whether that's publicly or privately. W stands for women loving women, similar to men loving men, and again, commonly used by communities of color. This is a twofer. Got away with this one. X and Y chromosomes. Females have the double X, while males possess an X and a Y. So sometimes what leads to intersex, some of the ways that lead to an intersex child is the common, the mosaic of those chromosomes. And Dad, you're the science guy, so I'm not going to get too much into this for fear of you correcting me. But those things happen and they get mixed up, and that is what brings you an intersex child. But again, it's important to note, don't surgically alter the child. Let them discover their identity. And then finally, this is not a common term, but again, I'm going for the Z here. And this is pronounced Z, Z-I-E, these are gender-neutral pronouns. So we're starting to get more comfortable with the they, them, their, but these were created before that, before people said screw grammar. And these were terms created by people who were just trying to look for some sort of gender-neutral pronoun so that they weren't mispronounced. They're not used often, but Z replaces he or she, and here replaces him or her. Notice this is just a combo. Okay. Tips for allies. Google it first. The reason I say that is because your LGBTQ identifying friend, family member, so on, is not your encyclopedia. Some people are okay and comfortable with having conversations about it and want to talk about it. That's why I'm up in front of you. But a lot of people don't just want to sit there and answer all your questions. Okay? I'm saying that very frankly, and I apologize for that. But Google was created for a reason. And there are plenty of resources out there that can answer your questions. So don't just go to your friend. Don't just go to your black friend every time you have a question about race. Or every time you have a question about Martin Luther King Day. Don't just go to the black person. So, you got a question about pride? Look it up. Don't just go to the gay person. Ask someone their pronouns and identity. I think I just mentioned this. It is okay to ask somebody their pronouns or identity. How do you do it? Hi. I'd like to respect your identity, so do you mind me asking what pronouns you use? There we go. Oh my God, how easy was that? That was so crazy. So it is very okay to go up to somebody and say, I would like to respect your identity. How do you identify and what are your pronouns? You don't even have to say how do you identify because maybe they don't want to say it. But just say, what are your pronouns? May I ask your pronouns? Again, cisgender people have been very lucky to live a life that is comfortable where people don't need to ask them. But now let's make a comfortable and safe and inclusive space for our people who are not comfortable. Be aware of your surroundings. So when you are asking questions, when you are talking about somebody's identity, when you are asking for pronouns, be aware of your surroundings. Because it's not always a safe space. So when you're at work or when you're, at any event really, you can ask, but just make sure that that person is comfortable. Because you never know who's around you and you never know the situation. I usually say this for teachers when we're talking about parents. Because some students, and this is, in DC Public Schools, students are allowed to go by a preferred name and preferred pronouns, and the parents are allowed, don't have to be notified. That is because the school is their safe space, for some. So we may refer to them as a pronoun, with pronouns and with a name that is not known to the parent. So as teachers, we do need to code switch. And we do, on Parent-Teacher Conference Day, talk about Jim when we know Janae. Okay? But it is important to recognize those surroundings. It is never about genitalia or the bathroom. Never, never, never. Who cares? Shut up. It is never about that. You are reducing the person to what's between their legs rather than who they are as the person. Don't do that. Understand circumstances for preferred pronouns. That goes back to be aware of the surroundings. Understand where and when this person identifies as such so that you can respect their identity. And then lastly, start referring to sex as assigned at birth, not real. not that people would go on and say that, but you know, when you are having that conversation, think about sex as something that is assigned at birth. Because kids don't have the option when they're born. They can't speak yet. They can barely think. They're learning a lot, but they can't say it yet. So don't just assume that somebody identifies as what they were assigned at birth, because it wasn't their choice. In Connecticut, you have a lovely organization called True Colors, Inc. It is a nonprofit organization. They produce a phenomenal conference every year. I think it was something like 6,000 participants that takes place at UConn. They're usually, GSA used to stand for Gay Straight Alliance, but to be more inclusive, they're now called Gender and Sexualities Alliances. Those are the clubs within schools that are created. And this True Colors does that conference for all those GSAs across Connecticut. So that is your go-to in terms of local resources. National resources, you have GLSEN. The acronym is super outdated. It's the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. So not super inclusive anymore. But they stuck with their name. And it is a national organization that was founded by teachers in Massachusetts to create more inclusive communities within schools. And then lastly, the Trevor Project is the leading national organization providing crisis intervention and suicide prevention services for LGBTQ youth under 25. So those are some resources. There are so many more out there. We'll leave that up for a moment. Okay. And that is my information. So feel free to write down my information. I do need to mention, it was on the first slide. I adapted this training from one that I received 8 years ago. I also have added to it using some of the resources provided by an organization called We Are Family in Charleston, South Carolina. So I cannot do this presentation without mentioning that, or else I think I can be sued. So that is all. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.